In 1884, an incident occurred in the Atlantic Ocean that was so gruesome that it would eventually forever be written into English law, with the hope that something like it would never happen again. This is that horrifying story, and although the events in this video are fleeting and non-descriptive, they are still highly disturbing, so viewer discretion is strongly advised. There's a name that's become so synonymous with maritime tragedy that anyone who has it is recommended to keep both feet firmly planted on dry land for life. That name is Richard Parker, and it has a unique place in the history of seafaring. It all began in 1797 when a man named Richard Parker was a lead conspirator in a naval mutiny. When his plans were discovered though, he was hanged from his own ship's yardarm. Then, exactly 40 years later, writer Edgar Allan Poe published a novel called The Narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym. And in it, a character named Richard Parker led a mutiny aboard a ship called the Grampus, which eventually wrecked. Richard, along with the other survivors of the sinking, were left adrift in the vast ocean in a dinghy with no supplies. After days of torturous hunger and thirst, Richard suggests to the others that they invoke something called the custom of the sea. This is a tradition no one who's ever sailed wants to be involved in, but all of the circumstances were just right for carrying it out. Unfortunately, this suggestion backfired for Richard and resulted in something horrific happening to him. But even that is not the final Richard. It's often said that fact is stranger than fiction, and in 1884, another Richard Parker would be entered into maritime legend and law books as part of a legal precedent that is still taught to this day. On May 19th of that year, a yacht known as the Mignonette left port from Southampton, England, with 4 men aboard: Captain Tom Dudley, crewmen Ed Brooks and Edwin Stevens, and Richard Parker, who was the cabin boy. The yacht had been bought by a wealthy Australian man, and the crew's job was going to be to deliver the boat to him. Tom had gotten the job because he had a long reputation as an excellent sailor and a man of integrity and honesty. He was also a natural leader for experienced and inexperienced men alike. Ed and Edwin were also seasoned, experienced sailors who had seen it all at sea, but for 17-year-old Richard, this would be his first big open water voyage. He did come from a family of seafarers, and he was no stranger to sailing, but the extent of his experience had been in shallower coastal waters. But despite this, it was a trip he was looking forward to with both excitement and apprehension, but his concerns eased after a few days on the open ocean. Their trip to Australia from Southampton was obviously a long one and required the ship sail south past Europe, then around Africa, before finally crossing the Indian Ocean to Australia. For more than a month of sailing, the crew faced very little trouble. The weather, short of a few squalls here and there, was cooperative, and the seas remained mostly calm, which the men were thankful for, being in such a small ship. The Mignonette was only 52 feet or 16 meters long, and getting it to Australia would be 15,000 miles of sailing. In fact, this was such a dangerous task that the wealthy Australian owner struggled to even form a crew to deliver it. Yachts, for the most part, typically weren't built for this type of journey, but unfortunately there was no other way to get the Mignonette to its new owner otherwise. So the 4 aboard the ship stayed cautious while still enjoying sailing in pristine conditions. All of this would change around 1,500 miles off the coast of Africa when the Mignonette was traveling from the Portuguese island of Madeira to Cape Town, South Africa. On July 5th, the yacht was ahead of a storm with winds up to 54 miles an hour or 87 kilometers an hour. Tom then gave the order to perform something called a heave-to. This is a way to adjust the sails and rudder so that they counteract one another. This then allows a boat to stay fairly stationary even in a storm, and if done correctly, the boat's bow will also be pointed slightly off to wind to reduce the impact of the waves as well. When Tom gave the order late at night, the men performed the heave-to, and as it was just about to be complete, he sent Richard below deck to grab him a cup of tea. As Richard got below deck though, a rogue wave smashed into the yacht and basically removed one entire side of it. Seeing this, Tom knew there was no chance of keeping the Mignonette above water and ordered that the lifeboat be lowered immediately. Then, in less than 5 minutes, the Mignonette was already on its way to the bottom of the ocean, and the 4 stunned men watched from their small dinghy that was barely suitable for a day of fishing in a calm lake. The boards that made up the lifeboat were only a 1/4 inch or 6 millimeters thick, and if that wasn't bad enough, the lowering of the lifeboat punctured a small hole in its hull. This was just the beginning though. Before the ship sank, Tom was only able to grab 2 1-pound tins of canned turnips and a chronometer, which is an instrument used for navigation. When the storm cleared, they found that there wasn't a speck of land in sight, and they had no drinkable water for the 4 of them. And if that wasn't bad enough, on their first night, a shark began bumping the lifeboat around, causing the crew to have to beat it back with their oars. Then, for 2 days, the four men ate and drank nothing at all, and it was then that Tom pulled out one of the cans of turnips and divided them into 5 pieces, which were then rationed out to the men over the next 2 days. But obviously, it wasn't nearly enough to survive on for long. Around July 9th, in a stroke of luck, Ed spotted a sea turtle, and Edwin was able to capture it. With no way to cook it, they had to eat it raw, but with about 3 pounds of meat on it, the turtle sustained them for a few extra days and stretched their supply of turnips. Unfortunately for them, killing the turtle was difficult and messy, and the blood became contaminated with seawater, so they weren't able to drink it. They did manage to consume the rest of it, but the turnips and turtle were completely gone by mid-July. As they got ever closer to dying of dehydration, the four men tried to catch rainwater to drink, but other than a few sips here and there, they weren't able to collect nearly enough to put a dent in their thirst. Things got so bad that they started drinking their own urine, which had the opposite effect of their intentions. Contrary to popular belief, this only dehydrates the body faster than not drinking anything at all. Additionally, the water content of it decreases with each ingestion, and as that happens, it becomes more concentrated with harmful waste. After a few more days, Richard couldn't take the pain of dehydration anymore and leaned over the side of the dinghy and started lapping up the seawater by the handful. Unlike drinking urine, it was already long known that drinking seawater was a big mistake. Had Richard had just a small amount of water, he probably would have been fine, but drinking it in large quantities like he did was likely a death sentence. When he drank his fill, he immediately felt relief, but as hours passed, he became violently sick. First, he was overcome with diarrhea as the seawater ran through him, and this only dehydrated him more. Then another day later, Richard's condition only worsened and he collapsed onto the bottom of the dinghy, basically unable to move. Meanwhile, the other 3 weren't much better off. They may not have been ill from drinking too much seawater, but they were ravenously hungry and very close to dying of thirst. It was then, as they watched Richard on the bottom of the boat, that Tom brought up the custom of the sea. As they talked about it, Edwin wasn't sure about it, and Ed flat out would not agree to it. That night, Richard deteriorated even more and was clearly close to death. Upon seeing this in the morning, Tom brought up the topic again, and once again he was rebuffed by Ed. Beyond the obvious reason that no one wants to eat another person, there was another good reason for his hesitancy. The custom of the sea requires such serious consideration because agreeing to it puts your own life on the line. It requires that everyone draw straws to determine the fate of one of the survivors of shipwreck. Whoever drew the shortest straw would be sacrificed so the others could live, meaning the loser would be eaten. This custom was obviously reserved for the most dire situations, and obviously is about as barbaric as it gets, but the way it was done, or said to have been done, was always strict and to the letter. In an odd way, there was a supposed integrity to the process that sailors at the time honored. The rules were unwritten, but as sailors understood them, there was very little room for interpretation. These are the 3 requirements that must be met for the custom of the sea to be performed. The first is that the situation had to be a dire one of life or death on the verge of starvation or dehydration. The second is that the decision had to be unanimous among survivors. If even one person was against the idea, it could go no further. And the third is that the selection process had to be fair, giving each sailor an equal chance to end up being chosen. Incredibly, at the time, although not what you might call socially acceptable, there was more of an understanding of this practice. If the custom was performed to the letter and the selection was fair, participating in it was seen as nothing to hide, even if it was still an incredibly difficult subject. There was sort of a grudging recognition of its necessity under certain circumstances. And because of the many dangers of the sea, the custom was not as rare as you might hope. The threat of a shipwreck during this time period was very real, and there were many unfortunate crews left to make the decision to sacrifice one of their own so the others could live. Legally, however, countries struggled to determine how to handle the custom while wrestling with the question of whether or not a murder could be justified by the necessity of a dire situation. Like, for example, in the 1600s, 7 English sailors were lost at sea for more than 2 weeks, and like the crew of the Mignonette, they had very little supplies in their lifeboat. In a twist of fate, the man who proposed the custom of the sea was the very same one who drew the short straw. When the survivors were rescued, they were returned to the Caribbean island of St. Christopher to stand trial for murder. However, the remaining survivors were pardoned after the judge found that the killing was indeed a necessity. In another example, in 1820, a whaling ship called the Essex was rammed by a whale and its survivors were scattered and separated into 3 small boats. During the survival ordeal, 6 died from either starvation or exposure or both, and 1 was sacrificed chosen by the custom. After drawing straws, a man named Owen was the unfortunate crewman who pulled the short one. His sacrifice then allowed the others to live and ultimately survive the ordeal. Back on the little dinghy later that night, Tom brought it up again, only this time with a slight change in his proposition. This time, instead of drawing straws, he proposed that they could just sacrifice Richard since it appeared as though he was going to die anyway. If that was the case, he might as well die so that the other three could live long enough to hopefully be rescued. Once again though, Ed would not hear of it. He found the idea to be repulsive and was surprised that someone of Tom's character and distinction would even suggest it. For Edwin, on the other hand, the idea began to make sense. As Tom pointed out, each of them had wives and multiple children, while Richard was still a teenager, and it would be better for a single man to die than for many children to grow up without fathers. With this suggestion, tension began to rise in the dinghy. Even though Ed was against the idea, since it was 2-on-1 and Tom had already decided to forego the rules, his protest might mean nothing in the end. But either way, no decision was made that night and the men agreed to sleep on it. As the next day wore on and there was no sign of land or life anywhere, Tom and Edwin made eye contact, which they both took as silent agreement to Tom's plan. For a moment, Tom paused to say a prayer while Edwin slowly knelt down at the bottom of the dinghy. When Tom was ready, Edwin grabbed hold of Richard's legs to keep him from flailing, and Tom brought his penknife down into Richard's neck. Edwin then continued to hold him down while Tom grabbed the case for the chronometer and began filling it from the wound he just made. When enough of it had accumulated, he then drank from the case before handing it to Edwin, who did the same. Edwin then extended it to Ed, who was stunned and horrified by what he was witnessing. Reluctantly though, he took the case and liquid filled his dry mouth for the first time in days. When Richard had passed, Tom and Edwin then undressed him and began removing the edible portions. Finally, they were full and satisfied for the first time since they caught the turtle. Tom and Edwin then continued to remove the edible portions they ate raw for as long as the remains stayed fresh. For the next 4 days, the three consumed as much as they could before it started to rot. Hunger set back in soon after, but on July 29th, only a few days after killing Richard, they finally saw a ship coming toward them. A German vessel named the Montezuma was on its way to Hamburg when it spotted the dinghy and brought Tom, Edwin, and Ed on board, ending what was almost a month-long ordeal. When they picked up the three survivors, the crew of the ship couldn't help but notice the state of the dinghy. The inside of it was coated in blood, and some of the remains were still on board. This obviously led to a lot of questions, but Tom told them everything. As captain, he felt justified in the decision because it was done out of necessity. After all, it was a survival practice that was more understood at the time. This didn't really lessen the impact, but then even more stunning for the crew of the Montezuma, Tom insisted on bringing the rotting remains on board so they could be given a proper Christian burial in England. It took more than a month for the ship to finish its journey, and when it arrived on September 6 in England, the Montezuma's captain accompanied Tom, Edwin, and Ed to see the customs officer and report their arrival. The four men then met with customs, and Tom explained the ordeal of being set adrift at sea and what happened to Richard, and as he did, a local police sergeant was in the room, listening in on everything. Given the disturbing events he just learned, the sergeant didn't know what to do with the three men and sought legal advice while keeping them detained. The captain and crew of the Montezuma were also not allowed to leave for Hamburg during this time because they'd be crucial witnesses if there were any legal proceedings. Then, after a brief investigation that included multiple interviews, Tom, Edwin, and Ed were charged with Richard's murder. And Tom, more than anyone else, was shocked by this. The way he saw it, anyone else in the same situation would have done the same thing. What Tom didn't know was that the English legal system was looking for an opportunity to establish murder at sea as a punishable crime. The law was still without a set precedent in cases of violent death at the hands of others at sea until the crew of the Mignonette arrived back in England. So in the days following their return, Tom, Edwin, and Ed were taken for arraignment. During this, and after learning of Ed's unwillingness to participate in Richard's killing, he was allowed to go free without penalty. Either way, this case and story would go on to be covered feverishly by European media. The story had sensational elements that gripped the public, and the sentiment was mostly in favor of Tom and Edwin's decision. There was even occasion for Tom and Edwin to meet Richard's brother, Daniel, and Daniel shook both their hands. As a sailor, Daniel believed they made the right decision. The judge who would hear the case, however, made it clear as the trial got started in November that there was no justification for killing another human being that the law would recognize, which many viewed as clear favoritism shown towards prosecutors. Additionally, being found guilty of murder at the time meant immediate execution, so if Tom and Edwin were found guilty, they would be put to death. But then when the jury finished their deliberations, they came to a unanimous decision that all of the men would have died if they hadn't done what they did. There was a caveat though. The judge had informed the jury prior to deliberations that they would have the option of returning a special verdict. By doing so, the jury would collectively recognize that they couldn't tell if Tom and Edwin were guilty of murder, and that's exactly the verdict they opted for. As a result, the case was sent to a higher court which consisted of 5 judges and no jury. Little time was wasted between the decision and the higher court beginning its proceedings, and this is where some sticky legal topics were sorted out. The defense argued that Richard's killing was a necessity based on the context of the situation. The problem with that argument, though, was that it had never been made before, so the trial was as much about the validity of that claim as it was about determining the guilt or innocence of Tom and Edwin. Afterward, there were two different precedents that the judges were presented as they heard the case. The first was killing in self-defense, which was recognized as a necessity in certain cases. Like, for example, if things played out where Richard fought back against Tom and Tom is the one who ended up dead, this would be considered a justifiable homicide. On the other hand, the prosecution argued that there was also established precedent for not justifying murder. In English law, a homeless man who steals a loaf of bread because he's starving is not justified in doing so, even though the theft was out of necessity. So in the end, the judges sided with the prosecution and Tom and Edwin were sentenced to death. The one thing the two men did have going for them throughout the trial, though, was public opinion, even after the verdict and sentencing were handed down. And because the two had so much support among citizens of the United Kingdom, the court felt pressure to pardon them, and this is what the media was expecting to happen to them next. Then, a few days passed with no word of one, and it looked bleak for Tom and Edwin. But thankfully for them, instead of a pardon, the court commuted the sentence down to just 6 months in prison. This was the first time any country had made any sort of legal decision on how to handle the custom of the sea, and the case remains a foundational reference to this day. So I'm curious, legal issues aside, since it's clearly understood what would happen if it were to happen today, what would you have done in the same situation as the men on the dinghy? Would you have drawn straws as per tradition, or would you have chosen the weakest, like they did? Or is there some other scenario that makes more sense? Let me know down in the comments what you think you would have done. In any case, thanks so much for watching. If you have a story suggestion, feel free to submit it to the form found in the description, and hopefully I will see you in the next one.